Willkommen, bienvenue, welcome once again to another live stream. I'm very pleased to be joined in the studio, as usual, on Fridays, but at a slightly earlier time, with the indomitable Hamish McLay of Search Convey, a man who has enabled us to gather a veritable force of personages specializing in the property game, but mostly focusing at the moment on building safety. And today's title, which is designed, I'm sorry, to put fox amongst feathers, is quite literally, who would want keys to Royal Artillery Quays? And there's a good reason for this title. Absolutely bowled over by the fact that we've got Steve Day, a man who was a one-man army against a certain Barrett Holmes, and we'll talk more about that later. And of course, Silas Lees of Wiggy Wham. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for making time to be with us today. Hamish, who would want keys to Artillery Quays? Please initiate us.
Well, let me first of all explain the qualifications of our two superb guests that we have today, who, in fact, I've only met in recent months, but I do actually consider them to be great friends, because they really are people that one would like to actually sort of speak to anyway, and one whose guidance and advice, because of their experiences, they can just show us so much.
Lived experience.
Silas as well. He is an author, and I'm reading this particular book, and it is absolutely superb. And I would suggest, if you can see the title, it's called Home Buyer Secrets. Now, Silas is in a great position to be able to explain about home buyer secrets. He comes from a background, he was an estate agent for a number of years. And what it is, and why I brought him here particularly today, is not just because of that knowledge. He has also been a surveyor, so he can tell us something of the expectation he would have when maybe looking at a property of this particular sort of type. Because unfortunately, the builders of Royal Artillery Quays are not accepting responsibility for certain materials they've had the property in. And so the safety can't be guaranteed. And what we were trying to do earlier, and I was trying to do this with Steve, was trying to get the council to hold fire on the planning permission they'd given, which was not actually going to solve the problem of the inflammable material on the property.
You would have thought, given recent years, Grenfell particularly, that the world would know better. And that also, let's face it, Steve, welcome, sorry. Let's face it, it was very public, dressing down and criminal proceedings, goodness knows what else. You would want to avoid that if you're a public listed company, would you not? And yet they've sallied forth in oblivious to the idea that eventually it's all going to come obviously clear. Welcome, Steve. So glad that you're with us. BuildingSafetyScheme.org, a man with lived experience, literally living right in the middle of the inferno, no pun intended. So first of all, give us an update where you're at. You were doing that just before we came on air. And then if you just follow on from Hamish's point.
Yes, well, thanks very much for having me on. I'm afraid it's a little bit noisy here because I'm on a campsite, so I've had to find a building with some Wi-Fi, but I've managed to. But anyway, so the building safety issues at Royal Artillery Quays are quite severe in the fact that Barrett Homes have been found to have not complied with building regulations at the time of construction with the external wall system, which is a Webertherm XM done by the company Saint-Gobain, which is a cladding manufacturer. It's a EPS cladding system, and the BBA certificate stated that it needed to be installed as per a specific specification to rely on test evidence. So the render thickness had to be a certain width. It wasn't the required width. The fixings on the fire breaks had to be metal. They were plastic and sometimes non-existent at all. And the adhesive pattern on the insulation onto the internal wall needed to be a grid pattern, but they used dot and dab. They failed on all three accounts. And as per ADB, those three specific areas had a substantial impact on the fire rating of the building. And that's a quote from ADB. So these are not small matters, these breaches. So they
might as well have clad it with straw, it sounds like to me.
Well, if you're going to put on flammable insulation with sort of firelighter type material solidified with some petrol-like substance, then you need to get your fire breaks between each floor right, don't you? You need to put your metal fixings on if the safety certificate says. Well, they didn't do that. They showed utter contempt. Anyway, they fought me for 2 years on this. And it was only when I realized what a BBA certificate was and managed to get it out of them that I managed to prove it. And then I told the cladding manufacturer, Saint-Gobain, that Barratt, haven't installed this right. And then they came after my sort of persuasion to investigate themselves, and they did their own intrusive investigation and spent quite a lot of money putting up a scaffolding risk. And then they did their tests and they condemned the installation. So we have an installation issue here, not a materials issue, an installation issue. And so our point to Barratt is, well, if you didn't install it correctly, safely, and unlawfully, then you should do the extra mile, go the extra mile, and fix the other things which legally you're not obliged to do. And that brings me on to our current state. So given that wrongdoing, we're saying, even though the developer contracts that Barratt have signed for remediation and our building's eligible for that, they only have to go to a B1 standard, which means this is an EWS1 assessment that lenders and insurers use, just for your listeners. So it's a kind of second type of assessment that is done separately from the government's regulations for buildings. And this basically condemns us to permanently high insurance. So estate agent body property marks, they're growing numbers of insurers, and that's a quote, are declining to insure buildings with an EWS overall rating of B1, which means if there's a declining in the insurance availability, that means A, we are at risk of not getting any cover, which has risks of us living there. And two, if we are lucky enough to get cover, and I say lucky in inverted commas, we'll have a very high premium, which we're already paying, because our service charges are $6,000 a year at the moment.
So an E1 rating, is that just barely enough to scrape through? But anything more sizable than a common or garden lighter would set the place ablaze? Is that? Am I overstating it?
No, it's a little bit. It's a B1 rating, right. But basically what it's saying is
barely enough.
Well, they consider it. Their response would be they consider it to be safe, and it's low risk.
But the insurance don't consider it to be safe, which is the important part here.
And you've got this different category of risk. You've got the life safety critical risk, which is what the builders are holding to, and then you've got building risk, which is what the insurers care about. What happens to the building when it burns down? So we're in a situation where we're right in the middle, and the actual risk of it is being passed on to us. But we have one caveat here. Now, this watered down standard for the developer contracts is a different standard to new buildings. So for new buildings, and I had the Department of Levelling Up and Communities at the time confirm in writing that these spandrel panels that we're talking about that's condemning us to this B1 rating is banned on new buildings. So it's safe to have on existing buildings, but not for new.
This is not just double standards. This is many, many standards. Well, how many standards all right, well, yeah. Enough, Steve. Otherwise, we'll just go down the rabbit hole. Yeah. Silas, it appears to me that corporate greed and fundamental stupidity seems to be winning the day. I mean, we've got the Clown Prince of America about to ascend to the throne. Is the world gone finally blithering mad?
It does appear that way, Gareth. I mean, there's a number of things that are going on here for me, and this reminds me very similarly when I was training to be a building surveyor many years ago, and we were showing videos of the tower blocks that were built in the 1960s.
Right.
And around Birmingham in particular, they were supposed to put these concrete panels into place with cranes and then concrete grout the joints and bolt them all together. And they found, I think it was 7 buildings that were held together by their own self-weight, i.e. no bolts, no concrete grouting. And there was
actually they were held together with hope.
Yeah. Hoping was definitely the strategy. And I think what we've got here is a very clear sign and a very clear indication of incompetence in the construction. From what I'm hearing Steve share.
Yeah, well, let me just highlight one thing. Steve said very clearly that, I mean, yes, I know the dot and dab and I get all that. But to me, flammable clips as opposed to metal clips is just a no-brainer. What are they playing at?
Yep. And that's a quality control issue on site. That's an installation issue. There's many elements. I mean, sometimes we do find that materials are deleterious later on after they've been used for a certain period of time. But my fundamental view is if this was a car manufacturer that had installed brakes incorrectly on cars and they were plowing into the back of one another, there would be an immediate recall and the manufacturer would put them right. And I don't understand why, when it comes to housing, it's either the leaseholders that take the risk or it's then the public purse that has to pick up the bill because the house builder sits on his hands and says, "Not my problem, mate." It's disgraceful. And I think
it's like to take your car analogy. It's like they've used bottle caps for brakes. It's what do they not? And what gets me, and forgive me for you really got me going today, Steve. What gets me here is that they've done this with almost a viewpoint that they won't be found out. That little schoolboys squaring away their sweeties behind the desk, hoping teacher never finds it. I mean, it's all going to come to light, and Barratt Homes, as a whole, will just get yet another black mark against their name. I'm sure it won't affect their share price favourably.
I think it's relying upon good people like Steve to do the work and expose these sorts of issues. And it does require, I think, a more heavy hand from government, if you like, to suggest that house builders need to correct these errors. It doesn't bode well. I mean, I've seen house builders where they've fitted shower screens with lump hammers. They're bashing them into place. And you just sit there and you think, my God, like, where is the quality control on the project management side of these developments?
Forgive me, and I'm sorry, I invite you builders and building control officers, if you're listening to this, come at me. But is this an intelligence issue? Is this a basic stupidity that they don't realise that bashing a glass panel with a lump hammer possibly won't end well?
I mean, in a previous life, I was a project manager for new build development, more on the commercial side than resi, but the things that I've seen walking around with site managers on site is utter chaos. I remember walking across one site where they cored out the floor slab for a lift shaft, and it was 3 floors where they just put a piece of 2 mil plywood over the lift shaft, and I almost walked over it and plummeted to my death. It's definitely, I think, book stops with site manager. You know, I think the problem.
What were people thinking? I mean, I think there should be an IQ test for people going on site.
I had a site manager say to me once, who said, if you put a sign up that said, "Do not cut your leg off whilst you're on site," somebody would do it just to spite you. And whilst that's, comical, and I don't know, the extent to what Steve shared here, if these panels were installed correctly, would the problem be as bad as it is right now? Would the insurers still be, putting the premiums up, or would they accept it that, okay, we accept that it's a retrofit or it's historic, and therefore we will grant insurance at a fair rate? Or is it a case that actually it was fundamentally badly installed and it should be take it.
Let me throw that at Steve. Steve, but I want to come back to you, Hamish, in a second. But Steve, I mean, the question is there. If they'd installed these damn panels correctly, would they? My mind, from what you've said, is that the insurers are condemning the material rather than the mode of fixing.
Yeah, well, and just to be clear, the panels were installed correctly. It's the EWS1 system, sorry, the EWS system that was. So there's two separate things here. There's huge white walls at rack full of EPS cladding. That's wall system 1, and then you got wall system 2, which is basically these XPS panels.
All right. Well, look. While Steve sorts out his connection, he is on a site, a campsite.
Sorry.
No, at all, Steve. Not at all. I'm just going to toss back to Hamish. Hamish, has the world gone bloody mad? I mean, it just seems to me there are fundamental crosses not being, tick boxes not being filled. There's fundamental quality issues being missed, and it could, without me overstating it, it could end up with massive loss of life.
I think that's the worst of it. We're looking at this from that particular aspect, because it's the safety of the people who are living there. And there's around about 1,000 people who are living under these conditions. They've been aware of them since 2018 when the information came out, because they carried out this inspection. Now, the concern to me, the type of work that we do, we go and gather information from the council.
Right.
And what we sort of showed earlier this week, that one of my researchers, Paula, she'd actually gone and got the information, and there's nothing to actually suggest that there's anything wrong with the building. Now, we are passing that information on to a solicitor to say, there you go, we've got this information. Now, we've collected that information, so we're believing what has been said. We can't be expected to go into every property and make sure that the site manager got it right. Worst of all, the building control people, the inspectors, they are meant to inspect the property against the conditions under which the planning permission has been given. And this clearly is whoever signed it off hasn't actually checked it out to see that it has met the conditions, because as Steve has mentioned, when somebody's actually gone in retrospectively to actually view what has been happening, they found out, well, no, it hasn't been done correctly. So what happened to building control? So this gives me an element of concern, because the Royal Artillery Quays is not the only place that you wouldn't want keys to, because there are thousands of other people in properties all over the country. I mean, Silas has mentioned a particular sort of area, and where we have high-rise flats, basically, over a certain height, they're all suspect until they've been fully checked out. And there are so many, and Steve is at the forefront there of the hard work that he's doing.
Well, he's the thin end of the wedge, it seems to me. If you don't mind, I'm going to grab Steve while I can. Steve. Yeah. I mean, first of all, I salute you for having made a stance in a position that most people would have keeled over and stuck their feet in the air and waited for providence. The fact that you actually, out of fight, flight, and freeze, you've taken up fight, I absolutely tip my hat to you, sir. However, am I right in thinking, as Hamish has intimated here, that basically there are many other locations where undisclosed and undiscovered situations similar to yours, perhaps worse even, may still be waiting to bite people on the arse?
Absolutely. There's a national scandal going on, and you've got buildings, 10,000 buildings I think are affected. You've also got absolutely, and this is why I've spent 3 years working in the House of Lords with the Earl of Lytton on legislation. So the buildingsafetyscheme.org is, as Silas says, it's like a car. You don't have to go to court. It's consumer protection legislation. So RICS qualified surveyors will come and do an intrusive investigation on the facade. They'll take 20 or 30 samples. If they failed the construction building regulations at the time of that construction was done, so we're not changing the goalposts, we're not saying the laws changed, now you have to pay. But if you legitimately, as we saw at Royal Artillery Quays, failed to meet regulations on the facade or any other defects, it covers structural as well as fire and, of course, the internal walls, then the RIC surveyors, under the power of the Act, can demand that a full remediation is paid for by the developer and or lead contractor. It's joint and several liability. It doesn't need the court. It's a quasi-judicial scheme, and we've had the current.
Last time it doesn't need the court. So no. Here's the question from silly boy here. I don't know this stuff at all. I'm learning on the fly. If it doesn't need the court, how do you enforce?
Oh, well, that's what a quasi-judicial scheme is. So a quasi-judicial scheme is a complicated legal word, but it basically means the primary legislation equips the RIC surveyor to make a judicial decision, a judicial judgment that is legally bound to make them pay for a full remediation that they can set. They set the scope of the works, and then the builder has to pay it, or the lead contractor, or if they don't exist, a levy. So we have a wide construction industry levy because we say it's a construction industry problem. So if we can't get the blighters that have done it and profited from it, we'll pass the risk on to the construction industry, which will be wider. That does include the cladding manufacturers that have made money out of flammable product. We say that's reprehensible and that they need to shoulder the risk. But if we can, we get the original developer or the lead contractor, and we also shame them publicly on a website, government website, which says, yeah, you're a really bad builder. You've got 100 determinations. Oh, no, but Barclays got 1,000. Oh, yeah, we really want to give them the contract. So it will drive all the problems down. I'm afraid these builders only understand one thing. That's the bottom line. Well, let's hit them where it hurts with the building safety scheme.
Silas, we need to name and shame these people on public television. I think it's horrendous.
I mean, I absolutely applaud you, Steve, for the work that you're doing, because there's an impact that the only way I could think to solve this problem is that the value of the apartments diminishes significantly if you can't get insurance, or that that you can't then sell them. There's no resale value, so the lender is on the hook. And that's a big guerrilla client, if you like, to bring into the frame and say, hang on a minute, you need to sort this out. So I applaud Steve and the work that you're doing there. I think it's fantastic. And I do think these people need to be held to account, because across the world, as you said earlier, Gareth, there's too many people getting away with what I would say is dishonest behaviour. And it's almost becoming the norm, and it needs to stop.
Yes, it's becoming acceptable. It's to cut corners and then throw your hands up and say, well, it's only a few screws, wasn't it? It was only a couple of clips. But the point is, do we need another Grenfell before anybody takes any notice? We had loss of life, loss of families, destruction of local social cohesion. I mean, do we need that to happen in our inner city somewhere before, finally, I mean, sorry, Barrett, you're the name that's on the cards at the moment. Barrett and others, do something about it, take responsibility. I guess, I mean, it's a bit like having a run on the bank. I guess if Barrett et al. Were to take it on board, take it on the chin and fix all 10,000 locations, they'd possibly be out of business. It's about that bottom line, is it not, Silas?
Well, I think the one thing that is at play here is that I believe a lot of these house builders have large land banks, and they sit on these land banks for a long period of time, which prevents a lot of development land coming up for sale or for development, and therefore slows the housing supply down substantially. Now, I know Labour has got this intent of building however many hundreds of thousands of homes by this time next year, but I think the challenge is that this could actually segue nicely into, let's free up some of this land bank. We've got to pay for all these repairs. Let's just move this forward. And I think that is a very fair way to actually start to free up the housing market.
Zara, Olubukus says building regs inspectors are self-employed. If they make a fuss, the developer won't call them for the next job. This is so true, isn't it? The self-employed man at the or woman at the coal edge doesn't want to ruffle feathers in case they don't get the next gig.
I think there's an element here of moral compass. And if I was to say to any of you guys here, if you were in the same position, would you make the same call? And I would like to think that we wouldn't. I'd like to think that we'd say, hang on a minute, there's a problem and we need to resolve this problem in order to keep life safe. And if the developer then says no, you resign from the post.
Yes, you see, but Silas, we are talking cloud cuckoo land here, where people aren't up against it, aren't worried about paycheck to paycheck. And I know a lot of people in the buildings trade are worried about losing contracts.
I understand. Sorry, Steve, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I just wanted to say one thing. So this is where we make the developer and lead contractor joint and severally liable. So instead of asking the building control to look the other way, they want them to help them, because it's not the building control that has liability now. It is them. And they're going to want the building control to actually do their job, because reverse the burden of proof. So yeah, we've dealt with that. And also legally, we have something called a reverse burden of proof. So we're very confident, because at building control sign-off, they have to say what test evidence they use to comply with the building regulations. Is it ADB? Is it a BBA certificate? Well, right. So they are now saying that they've met regs. So now if we find evidence from our intrusive investigations in our scheme that they don't, they now have to prove what other test evidence they relied on if they've invalidated the one they claimed. So there's a reverse burden of proof. So they will want the building inspectors to do their job for the first time in history. And this is why the former Premier of Victoria, Australia, has endorsed the scheme, Ted Barlow, right? This is a global chance for construction change, because these wrongdoers will only understand one thing as joint and several liability on them forever. No limitations today or ever. They will always be liable, and they have to fix it again and again.
Several liability forever. Yeah. You heard it here, folks. Yeah. Hamish, would you take us home, please?
Well, we've got to wind up now. What I would actually sort of suggest, because alongside of this, the poor buyer of any property doesn't know things like this necessarily are going on. But if you actually get hold of Silas's book, you don't just get hold of his book.
No, before we go, Silas, would you tell us a little bit why you wrote the book and fundamentally who should read it?
Thank you. So very briefly, when I was an estate agent, I thought I knew everything about buying and selling property. And I left that profession, went through becoming a surveyor, project manager, then a property investor. And I found that you could buy or sell a property within literally 3 days. That's not just making an offer. That's actually completing the entire transaction. And with that knowledge, I see so many people, like 1 million people a year, struggling to buy and sell homes and getting themselves into a right mess. I mean, imagine going to buy a property like this and then finding out, actually, I can't get a mortgage, or I bought it and now I can't resell it. What do you do? And that's really about sort of sharing some of that knowledge with people to really help them through navigate the maze of buying and selling a property.
I'm absolutely blown away that it's taken someone like Steve to bloody stand up and say no more before we actually get this through. Silas, thank you for the great work you're doing. I think, could you show us the book again, Hamish? Just lift it up for a second. Go and check this out. Silas is quite happily lifting the lid on things that you should know, guys.
I think we can access it through WikiWam, can't we, Silas, if memory serves? It's certainly available through Amazon.
Yep.
I mean, the best thing to do, to be perfectly honest, is do it through Silas, because that way you make contact with Silas.
So please, everybody, look up Silas J. Lees and WikiWam UK. Got a last final comment from Zara, who says 3 days not a realistic time scale to spend so much money. I promise you, Zara, my first wife could spend double that amount of money in under 2 hours. Anyway, moving swiftly on. Let's not go there. thank you once again, Silas, for making time, and Steve, brilliant. We will have you both back, I'm afraid, whether you like it or not, for further comment down the line. I did give you the challenge, Steve, last time we spoke, because the next time we have some serious movement, we want to hear, because there are still machinations to go through, are there not? So I want to hear some great news from here, and all of us can learn something from this. You may there's a general thing I want to make out before I just thank all of you properly, which is you may put off stuff that could be deleterious to either conditions now or in the future. You may put it off, but it will come and bite you back on the arse, and potentially it could end up with loss of life. So just do it right first time, for God's sakes. Hamish, wonderful. Thank you so much for putting this together. Silas, thank you for attending. Steve Day, inspirational gentlemen, both of you. Until next week, remember, shameless plug, Thursdays at 10 o'clock is Property Quorum. It's our flagship product, if it were, where you can get to hear proper arguments and discussion on property matters, where we talk about things a bit more close to home with Hamish McLay and myself. And I wish all of you, please keep your feet on the ground, keep reaching for the stars, and try and look after your mental health, and wear some sunscreen. It's getting bloody hot out there. Have a wonderful weekend, everyone. Bye-bye.